Okie doke, and whammo blammo, we are live. Okay, all three outlets, which would be Rumble, YouTube, and X. Good, good, good. I will have to eventually try to figure out how to get a Kick channel up and going as well. We shall see if that ever does come along. Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins-Treworgy, also known as Byron Insidious. And today, as indicated by the title of today's stream and the description, I'm just going to be really trying to spend a little bit of time talking about an observation that I've made over the last few years regarding a tendency in the genres of fantasy especially, and even a little bit in sci-fi, to utilize a particular group setting of 3 and 4 elements or characterizations and archetypes in order to effectively characterize and motivate the primary protagonists or world-building elements and archetypal systems that operate within the framework of these genre world settings. It's something that actually goes beyond the realm of the bookish in novels and short stories, and it seeps its way into television and film, and we see it actually crop up quite a bit in the realm of video games, particularly fantasy-based video games. And it took me a while to really come up with or locate, by looking through some of my tomes of mythology, some prized examples for my liking of these trilogies and tetralogies. Tetralogy just meaning a group of 4 rather than 3, being held at play. And that you see these groupings crop up more often than you might think. And it tends to run along kind of, in terms of tabletop role-playing terminology, it tends to run along class lines. And so you've got these class triads or tetralogies or quartets in legendarium, in mythology, and in genre fiction, broadly speaking. Now, one could easily think, well, maybe what he's talking about is something that he referred to when reviewing Herman P. Hunter's The Revenant and the Tomb. Excellent read. I recommend going and grabbing a copy off of Amazon. It is available in ebook. He also has it available in audiobook format, or you can get the trade paperback edition. It's a great novella, and Mr. Hunter could certainly use the support. He's also one of the more accessible indie authors who I've touched base with over the last couple of years. He's very open to conversation when he's feeling up for it. There are, of course, in everyone's life, circumstances that make them a little less easily accessible or open to communication given whatever is going on in their lives. But that's the nature of being human. But in his work, I had made note that there was kind of a noticeable parallel in that his primary characters of Halcedric, Herodiani, Tulgir, and Dram, while they were all mostly human, at least in presentation, they did kind of fill the traditional fantasy layout of human, elf, and dwarf, and in the case of Halcedric, enhanced human. Tolgir, the Woadman, is very easily coded to dwarves in your standard fantasy fare. His braided hair, his tendency towards earthen magics or towards earthen stone fashioning and kind of an appreciation of the deep caverns, caves, spelunking, earthen elements being tied to that. His character of Herodiani, she is very much coded as an elf, though she is what is referred to as a member of the Alani, or also referred to within the text of the book itself, the Ageless Ones, hailing from a realm that is populated only by these Ilani folk, kind of an enchanted realm, similar to Tolkien's faraway lands for the elven peoples. You have Drom, the guide, who shows up in the book early on. He's being negotiated with by Hal Cedric to guide them towards this tomb that is the central kind of destination that he and his companions, Tolgir and Herodiani, are going towards. He's sort of a standard human, whereas Hal Cedric himself would be much akin to Aragorn in Lord of the Rings series, in that he is an enhanced human. Aragorn himself being a descendant of Numenorians, an enhanced kind of human being, touched or blessed by some not quite human grace. Very much different in The Revenant of the Tomb. Hal Cedric's different nature stems from something a little bit different. What exactly is it? I would encourage you to pick up a copy of The Revenant of the Tomb if you want to find out for yourself. Little plug for Mr. Hunter. But anyway, in most fantasy fiction, it actually does not tend to differentiate between species or race. While having a broad variety of races present in the fiction itself is a key component that shows up, broadly speaking, across most fantasy literature. You even find it in the wonderful works of Sir Terry Pratchett, who created the Discworld novels. You see all kinds of different species of creatures commingling across cultural lines. You've got the vampire investigative journalist, photojournalist, who carries around a broom and dustpan and a little note, because every time he uses the flash bulb to take his pictures, the brightness of that flash is so bright it reduces him to black dust. And the little note instructs any onlookers to please sweep up his ashes and place them in a dark bag and take that bag to a dark place out of the sun so that he can reconstitute. Pratchett's vampires work a little bit differently than your classic vampires, obviously. For a classic vampire, being exposed to the sun, they burn up, they're dead and dusted, they're gone. Otto is a slightly different circumstance. Again, fascinating, amusing character and an amusing take on the mythology of vampires. Another series of fantasy novels I highly recommend. Yes, he is not an indie author, but the late, great Sir Terry Pratchett did some amazing work in the genre of fantasy that I cannot help but encourage people to give a try. But you have vampires, you have werewolves, you've got all kinds of weird creatures living in amongst one another and having their own cultures and customs, but also trying to integrate, particularly in the vast city-state of Ankh-Morpork. But even those characters have a tendency to kind of be differentiated off into one of three primary categories, not divided on lines of species or speciation, but rather divided off into class roles of archetype. And in fantasy, there are three primary archetypal roles that end up getting developed into these characters, are folded in as a key component of their personality and their approach to various challenges that arise throughout the course of the world building and the plot of the novels or short stories that they are engaged in. The warrior, the rogue, and the mage or spellcaster. Tabletop role-playing aficionados and veterans will say, well, what about the healer? That's, a cleric or a priest. I can see the argumentation made there. I'm empathetic to it. But if you look back at the long tradition of tabletop role-playing, there tends to be a definitional delineation made between mages and clerics or priests, in that they're mage types. They attain arcane mastery and the use of magical abilities through rigorous study or heritability. They inherit magical abilities. That's how you end up with things like the whole chosen one, bloodline patronage for access to magical and arcane powers, versus clerics. They utilize divine power and blessing as their form or avenue of access to magical powers and abilities. The reason why I would kind of shorthand those or combine them into one archetype as spell user or spellcaster is because how you get to that power really only is delineated primarily in tabletop role playing games. Or if you have a character who specifically in a work of fiction is granted their powers and abilities through a divine connection to some god or eldritch being or demigod or spectral outside being beyond the realm of the mortal. Again, it's arcane power, arcane access, how they get to it, whether it be through study, bloodline, or prayer and worship. It all boils down to the same thing. Accessing woo-woo abilities in order to affect change throughout the story and combat. So you have, again, your warrior, your mage, and your rogues. Rogues, when I use that term, I do not specifically always mean thieves or cut purses or even necessarily con men. Those all tend to end up getting rolled into the same classification. You've got folks like in the Witcher series, Dandelion, the bard, who is himself kind of a roguish character. He is underhanded, he's duplicitous, he's sneaky, he uses stealth, subterfuge, and utilization of information networks without necessarily being a bold and brave frontline fighter. But he is key in assisting the propulsion of the story of Geralt of Rivia. He's somebody who his skills and abilities, his access, and his cleverness, his guile is dependent upon in order to be an effective character for the propulsion of the protagonist's quest, journey, or mission. And you find this littered throughout fantasy. You also find instances of it in classical mythology. I'll get to offering some examples of that in a minute. Unfortunately, I've been drinking a lot of coffee, so as an older fella, I gotta go hit the bathroom quick. Back in a moment. There we go. My apologies for that, for already having to step away. But in my standard or typical fashion, got some handwritten notes to go over briefly just to touch upon this topic area for today. In terms of looking at this class system or this class trinity or tetralogy, because it does differentiate sometimes. One of the first examples that I came across when looking through my mythology tomes, specifically, whoa, man down, Shit, sorry about that. Was from Norse Myths and Tales from Flame Tree Publishing. These are wonderful collector's editions. I got most of mine in half-price books. Oh, come on. This thing is going off the rails pretty quick. Damn it. I should have known better. Because every time I pull one of these off of here, they all end up falling over. Sorry about that. Bit of a klutz. But in Norse mythology, there is a tale referred to as Valhallan Sagan. I don't know what that translates to. But there is a tale about a group of friends who are trying to find their way to Valhalla. And this myth features characters of Hrothgun, Malra, Bolthas, and Giftirbil. Hrothgun is the leader of his specific Viking clan, Clan Vosa. They are trying to find their way to Valhalla to retrieve a soul, the soul of one of Hrothgun's brothers, because he believes that his brother does not belong in Valhalla, that his brother was a fiend because his brother did some unpleasant things to his sister and does not believe that the Valkyries should have claimed his soul for Valhalla, that he should be destined for hell. And he is Hrothgun himself is a proud and noble Viking warrior. His wife, Malra, who accompanies him on this journey to try and seek out a mortal plane portal or access into the realms of Valhalla, she is herself a medicine woman, kind of a healer, again, sort of leaning towards that mage or clerical type. Balthus, one of Hrothgun's long-standing friends and allies in the clan's efforts to expand and to secure their settlement, is something more of a roguish sort. He is a friend. He relies more on stealth, on being small as a member of the clan. A lot of his fellows poke fun at him for being so svelte and so tiny, yet he uses that minuscule stature to dart about the battlefield and to steal his opponent's weapons and their goods, their supplies, and bring them over to the clan's camp in order to make proper, better use of them, thus denying their enemies of their needs and their goods and supplies, while also bolstering the supplies of the clan. He's not a powerful warrior. He's thoughtful. He relies on guile, stealth, speed, and subterfuge, leaning towards that rogue-type role. And there is Giftirval, an elder or sage of the clan who invokes the reading and summoning of ancient runes in order to try and access the portal that ultimately grants them temporary access into Valhalla, whereupon they are informed, if you wish to bring out this warrior who we have claimed as a mortal soul to fight on behalf of Valhalla and behalf of Midgard in Ragnarok, one of you will have to take his place. And in the long run, you're only bringing this person out in order to judge him and probably execute him for the crime of doing what he did, basically raping Hrothgun's sister and leaving her half dead. So you're going to bring this soul out of Valhalla just to kill him. And the gods, the Norse gods, are a little confused. The Valkyries are confused because this exchange would require the sacrifice of a member of this group that will ultimately gain nothing for them or their village. But Hrothgun clarifies that not only is he prepared to make that sacrifice himself if need be, because justice must be done, but in the long run, it's the old man Gif who says, well, I'll do it. I'll die. I'll stay here. I've already lived my life. I've done my job. I've done my duty. I got them in here to complete the mission, and I'm an old man. And this is what should be done for honor. You also find this class type trio wending its way through one of the many legends of Cuchulainn, a heroic demigod figure in Irish or Celtic mythology. Cuchulainn himself being a demigod warrior, an adventurer, often traveling about and getting into all sorts of shenanigans with Brunella, a sorceress who often accompanies him on his adventures and his quests, providing wisdom and providing access to fey powers and magics that Cuchulainn himself has no use of. And Braden Finney, a wandering singer and pickpocket who Cuchulainn catches trying to pick his pocket in one of the older legends of Cuchulainn. But he lets Braden live and just kind of slaps him around a little bit, and he lets Braden become his companion because Cuchulainn finds him entertaining and discovers that Braden is not just a cutpurse, that Braden Finney steals from those who have robbed or abused or extorted others and gives much of his ill-gotten gains to those who are less fortunate or ill and sickly. A kind of archetype or framework for a character in English mythology who we would later come to know as Sir Robin of Locksley, Robin Hood. I already covered a little bit the Lord of the Rings obvious kind of class structure, in that you find Aragorn to be the warrior type who has some sagacious kind of knowledge and ability. The hobbits, I would mark them all as roguish types because they rely on being diminutive, being swift, relying on skill and kind of being clever in order to get by in the scenarios that they find themselves in. Legolas, I would peg as more sort of a warrior roguish type, kind of a mix of the two, because he is primarily portrayed in particularly the Jackson films as an archer with a capacity for close range combat if necessary, but he is also dependent upon his skills and abilities, his knowledge, to contribute to the quest and the mission of the Fellowship. And Gandalf, well, it's kind of obvious. He's the mage type. He's a wizard. This class breakdown does not simply exist in fantasy, though. You will also find it extant in sci-fi. The first example I've got written down here is one that will probably infuriate some folks who are longtime fans of the franchise, Star Wars. I would argue that Star Wars breaks down pretty cleanly into the three-class arrangement. You've got Luke, who is initially a young warrior, a trainee, an adept who is just learning the ways of combat from Obi-Wan, who is himself a mage warrior combination, being a Jedi. All Jedi are kind of warrior monks in the original Lucas mythology, the way that it's arranged. And I would point you to the Force abilities as the example of magic as instantiated in the Star Wars mythology. And Luke himself eventually becomes a Jedi Master, thus filling that that warrior mage duology, that kind of hybrid dual class, if you will. Han Solo, obviously a rogue. And Chewbacca, clearly a pure warrior type. I would even go forward to say that one of the best examples that you get of this breakdown of the three class types comes to us not from the movies or even from the books. It actually comes from a video game adaptation, Knights of the Old Republic. When you start a playthrough of Knights of the Old Republic, you begin as either a a soldier, a scoundrel, or I forget what the name of the third class type was, but basically, kind of your mage type, your sage. It's made more obvious in the sequel, The Sith Lords, Knights of the Old Republic 2, when the starting character types or classes you get to choose from are Jedi Guardian, Jedi Sentinel, or Jedi Consular, focusing on either combat, skills and abilities, or force powers and abilities. It's that trilogy, that trio, that always comes down and breaks down in that. Your three primary archetypes. You'll find it in the Dragon Age games, when you start off as either a warrior, a rogue, or a mage. Now, yes, each of those classes has their own distinct kind of tendencies and favoring an ability set type. For warriors, you've got your sword and shield combination type of warrior, or you've got your berserker type of warrior who just goes for bloodletting and bloodshedding, over the top, bombastic barbarian sort. Your rogues, you have either your archers or your in close short dagger swift hit and run types, your almost assassin types. And in mages, you have either overwhelming damage and crowd control or your support type mage in the Dragon Age games. So you've got differentiation in focus for each of your primary character archetypes, your class types. But again, when you boil it down, it comes down to that trio: your warrior, your mage, or your rogue. It's present even in Diablo and the kind of clone of Diablo, Torchlight, which I've brought up before because I love the Torchlight games. At least the first two. I've never played the third one. So maybe I'll see someday if I have the time and budget to pick up a copy of that. But your three primary character class choices are warrior, mage, rogue. They're not called that, but those are your basic class types. Sometimes you can get kind of a hybrid of the two, depending on, I think there's like a fourth and a fifth character base type for Torchlight that you can go off of, similar in Diablo. But it all boils down to those three: your warrior, your mage, your rogue. Another example I would point to, going back to fantasy, in animation, Avatar: The Last Airbender. You've got Aang, who is your warrior mage kind of dual class. He's the Avatar. He's a bender, obviously. You've got Katara, who is herself a fledgling acolyte waterbender, a mage type. You have Sokka, who is just a straight up warrior, but he has some roguish tendencies and skills and abilities. He doesn't just rely on overwhelming force or brute martial ability. He does utilize some deeper thinking and tactical deployment of cleverly arranged resources. In the character of Uncle Iroh, you have your kind of wise sage warrior mage combination. Again, you have that trio, that warrior mage rogue. As far as the other element, the power of four, which is especially relevant to the Last Airbender series, in Aang you have air, right to begin with. In Katara you have water. In Iroh you have fire. And in Toph, who comes along later on, you've got earth. That tetralogy of balance is key to the entire Avatar series and that mythology. You'll find it frequently. It's one of the most frequent tetralogies you'll find in fantasy settings. It's the balance of fire, water, earth, and air. Oftentimes associated or closely associated and tied to the cardinal compass points of north, south, east, and west. Sometimes these elements get kind of tagged or lashed to a compass direction, a cardinal direction. Not always, though. But this tetralogy could, if you're going off of the split division of mage types into cleric and mage, you still have that four. Fire, earth, air, water. north, south, east, west, warrior, mage, rogue, cleric, if you want to go that extra step in dividing. But again, I tend to stick with the primary trilogy, the triad, the power of three in there. In tabletop role-playing games, you have your good, evil, and neutral. Oftentimes, well, depending on which tabletop system you're utilizing, if it's like Call of Cthulhu, there will be that fourth branch that's kind of off to the side of just madness. In Stephen Erickson's Tales of the Malazan Books of the Fallen, you have a definitive triad in terms of world-building powers and alignment of nations. You have your light, you have your dark, and then you have something in between that's not quite neutral per se. It's referred to as shadow. That combination blend of light and dark that drifts along its own queer path. By queer, I mean weird. Nowadays, you have to clarify that. That's how bad things have gotten in some regards. Just have to hit the bathroom again real quick. Again, my apologies for that. I will need just a moment. Hold on 1 second. Throw on some music in the background here until I get back. Back in a moment. Wall. Every color, every slogan, every cause, every call. You march every weekend, phone held high like a torch. But the flag on your doorstep got rolled up on the porch. Whose flag are you waving when you touch the ground you're standing on? You talk like you hate this place, but you're shouting 'cause they hung on. Whose flag are you waving when you spit on the ones who bled? You're using every right they want just to drag the house they're buried in. You tweet this land is broken from a campus green and safe. Got a sign about resistance, but you'll never read the graves. You scream all power to the people from a life that you were handed. Names on rusted crosses in a field you never visited. Whose flag are you waving when you touch the ground you're standing on? You talk like you hate this place, but you're shouting 'cause they hung on. Whose flag are you waving while you spit on the ones who bled? You're using every right they want. Greetings, Raisin. Welcome on in. I wouldn't say you missed too much, honey. I'm just rambling about fantasy, sci-fi, warriors, mages, rogues, bookish things. But sticking with animation and going back over to sci-fi, the next example that came to mind, I didn't write it down actually. It just popped into my head when I was preparing to come downstairs and start the show, is a rather popular anime, Cowboy Bebop. Even Cowboy Bebop, I would argue, falls into the classical example of utilizing the trinity of class or archetype for its primary protagonist group. Jet, I would argue, is basically your primary essential warrior sort. He is straightforward, he's aggressive, he is kind of your brute, but he's not without wit or intellectual capacity. Especially because the black dog he doesn't let go. He used to be a detective, is my recollection. I haven't watched the show in a long time, so I could be wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, please. But he's a bulldog. He's a big guy. He is a physical savage. Spike Spiegel is more sort of your lithe warrior rogue combination. Yes, he is capable in a physical altercation. He's shown practicing and utilizing or deploying elements and maneuvers and techniques from Jeet Kune Do, JKD. I would certainly say his stylistic movements are reminiscent of a Bruce Lee sort in animated form. But he deploys a lot of gunplay, and he utilizes traps and trickery, subterfuge, and underhanded tactics when he's out in the field. Now, of course, I say underhanded, but it's only really underhanded if you are a, quote, good guy. And these folks are bounty hunters. They swim in the pool of gray area. The Earl Grey Bandit. Let's go ahead and highlight that. You should save a couple of your Social Security disability checks to go to a dentist and also invest some shampoo for that greasy hair. Thanks for that. But in all seriousness, then you move along to another character from the primary protagonist group in Bebop, in the character of Faye Valentine. Now, while Faye certainly has her skills and abilities, they tend to be more of the roguish sort. She is a bit of a con artist. That's how she even got roped into working with Spike and Jet in the first place. She is somewhat outside of the standard rogue archetype, however, because she does utilize a lot of high-end technology to effect her arrests or bounty captures. So she's not purely rogue. She does utilize overwhelming force where necessary and within the scope of her abilities. So you've got your warrior, you've got your rogue represented. Definitely you've got your warrior in Jet, you've got your rogue in Faye, and you have your mix of the two in Spike. So where's your mage type? That would come in the form of Ed. Being a hacker and being a high-end, tech-savvy character who utilizes hacking, who utilizes the deployment of high-end cyber technology, Ed would represent your mage sort within the confines of the Cowboy Bebop crew, I would argue. At least that would be my personal outlook on the Cowboy Bebop crew. If we're going to look at them through the lens of this trilogy or tetralogy of class archetypes in presentation within the confines of that framework. And this comes up, like I said, quite a lot in fantasy and sci-fi. But also, as I mentioned before, shows up in older mythologies. It's not all just modern day or in the last 100 or 200 years in genre fiction. It shows up all over the place in literary structures and frameworks. You have this kind of standardized set that speaks powerfully to primary archetypes in narrative construction and deployment. It's not universal. I'm not someone who could sit here and say, this is absolutely how it happens every time, all the time. No. But I do observe that it happens quite a lot. It's to deny that it's there would be to deny the evidence of your own eyes if you read anything, or if you watch enough film or television, or even in this case, anime. Separate those notes. And that potential for the power of 4, it doesn't just show up in your character archetypes, it also shows up in world building. When we look at the classical example of Lord of the Rings, you obviously have the forces of the Fellowship, humans, elves, and dwarves, fighting against Sauron's forces, the orcs, the Uruk-hai, the Easterlings, Saruman's forces. So you have that duology. But there is a third grouping, which is everybody who's caught in between. Your everyday civilians, average everyday people, even in the world building setting like Lord of the Rings, or you find it in Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels, people who are not protagonists or antagonists, they're just everyday people trying to go about living their lives. That's a third grouping. Again, you have that trilogy, that triumvirate, that triad. And then you sometimes have a fourth grouping in people who, they're not on either side of the conflict, but they're not just everyday normie civilians. They're kind of mercenaries trying to make their way in the world by manipulating or taking advantage of the chaos of conflict in order to get their bag and get the hell out. You'll find them pop up all throughout fantasy and sci-fi literature as well. And again, that plays into that trilogy or that tetralogy, where it can usually present as three forces or elements and groupings, but occasionally a fourth one kind of bleeds in along the edge. You can look at this even if you take a look at it through the lens of faith. If you look at Christendom, you have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But there is a fourth element that can kind of budge its way in the church, depending on what your denomination is. And again, that's open to interpretation, depending on who's looking at it and what the conversation specifically is. I'm no great theologian. I guarantee that I would get dumpstered if someone a lot more well-versed in that arena were to try and open a conversation and make it more of a debate rather than just a dialogue back and forth. I guarantee I would lose that one handily. So I try not to lean in that direction too much. I will stick to my mythology and my genre fiction. That's where I have my familiarity. I will do more reading and more research in order to brush up and get a little bit more acquainted with theological conversation and debate in order to get a greater grasp on that particular dive into the conversational realm. What else? Oh, that's all stuff for a whole other topic for another day. So for the most part, you have that power of 3, or potentially power of 4, in fantasy and sci-fi. And that's pretty much going to wrap it up for me for the primary portion, actually the vast majority of the program. If anybody still watching has any comments, questions, or concerns, open to hearing that and trying to touch base for a few more minutes. But I will probably be wrapping up pretty shortly. We're approaching 45-minute mark. This wasn't really a deeply planned program, but I'm open to conversation. Briefly, in terms of what kicked off my decision to jot down these observations or to notice this kind of repeated pattern of trios or trilogies or tetralogies in terms of protagonist group or party assembly. It all kicked off for me about 4 or 5 days ago with an observation from somebody on X/Twitter. It was someone who I follow who does a lot of posts about tabletop role playing games and the groups that they're in, and that they the adventures or quests that they've run, the campaigns. And he was saying, I really enjoy the group of people who I've been playing with for years, and they've always managed to maintain survivability because they know to balance their party. This most recent campaign they started, they made the severe tactical error of nobody in his group, and there's 5 players in his group. None of them chose a spellcaster or healer type. Normally, he was observing that normally he would try to figure out a way to balance his dungeons or his quest line to accommodate for the choices that his players make. But he's always emphasized, hey, you guys should probably try to have at least some kind of balance or rounding in your group. But this one time, 4 of his 5 players decided to be kind of over-the-top, overbearing battle rager types, completely focused on combat and min-maxing. He had one player who decided to be kind of a roguish type with lots of abilities and skills and equipment and gear to bring along to help the party through their mission, crawling through this dungeon full of goblins. The problem was the DM himself had set up a lot of high damage traps throughout this dungeon. The monsters themselves were not the primary danger. It was the traps, which required thought and common sense in order to work their way around and through. These barbarian type characters, 2 of the 4 barbarian sorts got themselves killed before they were even halfway through the dungeon. And there was no healer to recover the lost hit points. The rogue had only brought a couple of healing potions. So by the time they got to this goblin baron at the end of the dungeon, there was only 1 fighter and 1 rogue left in the group, and they were both severely injured and were out of healing equipment, and they died. They were dead before they even completed the first dungeon for this campaign, because there was no balance. There was no yin-yang. It was all overbearingly focused on straight up damage and dealing overwhelming amounts of damage. They were kind of going off the philosophy of the best defense is a relentless offense. That doesn't always work out. It doesn't work out in tabletop, and I doubt it would ever really work out very well in genre fiction of the literary sort. You have to have those component elements of skill and ability and something a little bit more guile-based, and someone who has a capacity for their arcane arts to provide either healing or sage advice and skills or powers or abilities that will augment or assist your primary heroic type in their quests and endeavors. Even the more bumble-headed, brick-brained characters in Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels, even the more overwhelming brutes, keep company with people who are a little bit more sharp of wit and arcane ability, or roguish sorts, in order to kind of balance their weak points. But that's what started this whole thing for me, was coming across that and thinking, balance is really key in the genre, and you find it everywhere you look, in fantasy and even in sci-fi. You don't find this sort of balance rearing its head as much in horror. Horror tends to be a lot more one-on-one, a lot more personal, a lot more. Your protagonist's weaknesses or shortcomings are ripe fodder for causing even greater conflict and danger and tension. You don't want perfect balance as a storyteller to convey a gripping sense of atmospheric dread. You want those shortcomings and those weaknesses, those blind spots, to be exploitable for your antagonistic or monstrous force. It allows not only for character development, it allows for tension and damage. You need that if you're going to go for something genuinely horrific. I think Clive Barker did it quite possibly one of the best examples of exploiting that weak spot in his The Great and Secret Show. I really think that was a fine example of how to properly convey in a kind of dark fantasy or fantastical horror story, which is itself a balancing blend of the genres of horror and fantasy, that those weak spots are wonderfully fertile soil for examining how that weak spot will be used by antagonistic forces, by the dark, the evil, the unpleasant, the insane. Though the insane has a tendency to just kind of go at random. Raisin, are you still there? Just briefly asking. Quick note here. Okay. Keep that on hand. Okay. Well, I think that's going to do it for me for today, ladies and gentlemen. Again, just wanted to talk a little bit about that observation that oftentimes in fantasy and sci-fi, we see that balance and that power of three, or sometimes four. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.